Lucian Ferraro had ordered men killed for less than a misplaced glance, but nothing in 20 years of running Chicago's underworld had ever gutted him the way the sight of his bookkeeper laughing at another man's joke did. She was sitting in a corner booth at Marrow, the kind of Gold Coast steakhouse where the waiters wore gloves and the wine list ran longer than a Bible, and she was wearing a dress he had never seen before, deep wine-colored silk. Off the shoulder, it clung to every soft curve of her like the fabric had been poured over her and left to set. And she was laughing, really laughing, head tipped back, throat bare, eyes bright, at something the slim, sandy-haired man across from her had just said. Lucian had come here to break a man's fingers, metaphorically speaking. Instead, he stood frozen in the shadow of the maitre d' stand, feeling something hot and primitive crack open in his chest, and for the first time in his adult life, the king of the North Side did not know what to do with his hands. Her name was Hazel Bishop, and almost no one who feared the Ferraro name knew she existed. That was by design. Hazel was 31 years old, a size 18, and the single most dangerous person in Lucian's entire organization, though she carried no weapon heavier than a fountain pen. She kept the books, not the clean ones that the accountants downtown signed off on with their tidy little signatures. Those were theater. Hazel kept the real ledger, the one that lived encrypted on a drive she wore on a chain beneath her blouse, the one that knew exactly how $40 million a year got rinsed through laundromats, parking structures, a chain of frozen yogurt shops, and a perfectly legitimate-looking commercial real estate fund in the suburbs. She had walked into the Ferraro building 5 years ago in an ill-fitting grey suit, a community college accounting certificate, and a resume with a 2-year gap she refused to explain. Lucian's consigliera had wanted to turn her away. Lucian, who trusted his gut the way other men trusted their priests, had hired her on the spot. He had never regretted it. Within 6 months, she had found 3 skimming operations his own captains had been running on him, untangled a money trail the feds had been chasing for a decade, and rebuilt the entire structure so cleanly that 2 separate federal grand juries had walked away empty-handed. She was, quietly, the reason he was still free. She was, quietly, the reason he was still alive. And in 5 years he had never once looked at her as a woman. That was a lie, he told himself, anyway. The truth was more complicated, and Lucian Ferraro did not like complicated truths. The truth was that he knew she took her coffee with too much cream and a single sugar. He knew that when she was nervous, she pressed her thumbnail into the side of her index finger until it left a crescent. He knew the exact register her voice dropped into when she was about to deliver news he wouldn't like. He knew she hummed old Patsy Cline songs under her breath when she thought the office was empty. He had filed all of it away the way he filed everything, as data, as leverage, as the careful inventory of a man who survived by missing nothing. And he had never once let himself ask why he remembered the sound of her humming better than he remembered his own mother's face. It had started on a Tuesday. Most disasters did. Hazel had come into his office at 4 in the afternoon with the week's reconciliation, and said, in that flat, smooth, all-business voice, "The Halstead property closed. Clean. I've already moved the proceeds." Then, after a pause that he would replay 100 times later, she had added, "Also, I'll be leaving at 5 on Friday. I have plans." Lucian had not looked up from the contract he was reading. "Cancel them. The Greco sit-down is Friday night. I need you to prep the numbers. The numbers are prepped. They're in the green folder. Renzo can walk you through them." She had smoothed the front of her skirt, a small habit she didn't know she had. "I'm leaving at 5. Something in her tone made him lift his head. Hazel never left at 5. Hazel was the last light on in the building most nights, matching his ungodly hours out of a loyalty he had come to take for granted, the way you take for granted the floor beneath your feet. He studied her, the soft jaw, the porcelain skin, the stubborn set of her mouth, and asked a question that escaped before his usual cold filter could stop it. "Where are you going?" A faint flush climbed her plump cheeks. "I have a date, Mr. Ferraro." The words landed in the cold, climate-controlled air and just hung there. A date. Lucian repeated it in his head and found it absurd. Not because he thought no one would want her. She had a gorgeous face and a tongue sharp enough to draw blood, and any man with sense would be lucky, but because the concept of Hazel having a life beyond the walls of this building was as foreign to him as the idea of his desk getting up and walking out the door. She was a fixture. She was his. He had never examined what that word meant when he applied it to her. With who? His voice had dropped an octave. He heard it happen and could not stop it. "That's my business." She held his gaze with a steadiness that made something flare hot under his sternum. "I'll see you Monday." Friday, the office was a minefield. Lucian snapped at a capo who'd misreported the take from the Cicero routes, threw a crystal tumbler hard enough to chip the marble, and spent the entire afternoon watching her through the glass partition of his office, like a man watching a clock count down to an execution. At 4:30, she disappeared into the private washroom. At 4:50, she came out, and every man on the floor forgot how to breathe. The grey suit was gone. The bun was gone. The wine-colored silk dress had taken its place, and her dark hair fell loose in thick waves over her bare shoulders, and her mouth was painted a red so deep it looked like a dare. She walked to the elevator, and the sound of her heels on the marble was the loudest thing in the world. Made men who had watched her hand them paychecks for years turned their heads in slow, dawning astonishment, as if a piece of office furniture had bloomed overnight into the most beautiful woman they'd ever seen. Lucian's jaw clenched until his molars ached. The elevator doors slid shut on a flash of crimson, and a feeling he refused to name detonated somewhere behind his ribs. He picked up the phone. "Get the car," he told Renzo, "and find out exactly where she's going." Renzo, who had been with him 15 years and knew when not to ask questions, called back in 11 minutes. The restaurant was Marrow. The reservation was under a name Lucian didn't recognize, Gregory Adler. By the time he walked through Marrow's doors in a black suit that cost more than the busboy made in a year, his hands buried in his pockets to hide the fact that they wanted to do violence, he had convinced himself he was here for reconnaissance. To make sure she wasn't being played. To make sure this Adler wasn't a Fed, a Greco plant, a setup. That was the lie. The truth was sitting in a velvet booth in a red dress, laughing, and the truth was destroying him. Gregory Adler, it turned out, was an actuary. Hazel had matched with him on an app. He was 40, balding gently at the temples, wore wire-rimmed glasses and a brown suit. And for the past 20 minutes he had been explaining mortality tables and municipal bond yields with the earnest enthusiasm of a man who had no idea how rare it was to have a woman like this actually listening. He was, by every measure, harmless. He was safe. He was legal. He was everything Lucian Ferraro had spent his entire life refusing to be. "So logistics," Gregory said, adjusting his glasses, his eyes flicking down to the swell of her neckline, and then darting back up, a nervous flush crawling up his throat. "That sounds demanding." "It is." Hazel sipped a Pinot and gave him the practiced half-smile she gave everyone who asked about her work. "Lots of late nights, inventory mostly, reconciling what came in against what went out." It was, technically, the truth. "You look very nice tonight, Gregory. You?" He cleared his throat. "You look stunning. Red's your color." And she laughed, soft and genuine, because it had been a long time since anyone had said something kind to her and meant it. And from the dark corner booth across the room, Lucian Ferraro watched that laugh leave her body and felt it land in his like a knife between the ribs. He was supposed to be negotiating a shipping corridor with Nico Greco, who sat across from him in a charcoal suit, methodically laying out terms for a route through the South Side ports in a low, rumbling voice. Lucian heard none of it. His eyes were locked on the booth. He watched Adler lean in. He watched the man's gaze linger a half-second too long on the soft, plush line of her shoulder, and a black, scalding jealousy rose up in him, thick as oil, and underneath it, underneath the possessiveness, the territorial fury. Something far more dangerous cracked open and let the light in. He wanted her, not as an asset, not as a fixture. He wanted the softness of her, the brilliance of her, the laugh she was spending on a man who would never understand a single thing about who she really was. He wanted to take the actuary by his polyester collar and throw him through the window. "Ferraro." Nico's voice cut through. "The docks, are we agreed?" Lucian rose slowly and dropped a $100 bill onto his untouched steak. "The docks are fine, Nico. Excuse me, I've got a pest problem to handle." Hazel was reaching for a piece of bread when the temperature at her table dropped 10 degrees. The ambient murmur of the restaurant guttered into a nervous hush. A shadow fell across the white linen. She looked up and the breath simply left her body, because standing beside the booth, hands in his pockets, eyes absolutely feral beneath that controlled glacial calm, was Lucian Ferraro. Mr. Ferraro. Her professional mask cracked clean down the middle. "What are you doing here?" He didn't look at her. His flat, dead shark's gaze was fixed entirely on Gregory, who had gone the color of cold ash. "You didn't introduce me to your friend, Hazel. Gregory." The actuary half rose, extended a trembling hand. "Gregory Adler, I'm a friend of Hazel's." Lucian regarded the hand the way a man regards roadkill. He did not take it, Adler, he said, rolling the name around his mouth like spoiled wine. Lucian Ferraro. I'm Hazel's employer, and I'm afraid I need her back at the office tonight. Heat flooded Hazel's face, indignation and humiliation in equal measure. I'm off the clock. We agreed. A situation developed. He shifted his weight, his broad frame angling to physically wall Gregory into the booth, and planted both scarred hands flat on the white tablecloth, invading their space like a thing the room had been built too small to hold. A shipment got seized. I need my lead reconciliation analyst now. Gregory's eyes ping-ponged between them. If it's an emergency, Hazel, I completely understand. We can always. No, Gregory, stay. Hazel's voice came out low and shaking, and her hazel eyes flashed up at her boss with a fury she had never once let him see in 5 years. Lucian, this is out of line. Whatever it is, Renzo can handle it until Monday. Lucian leaned down until his face was inches from hers. He could smell her perfume, warm vanilla, dark amber, something sweet under all that armor, and his gaze dropped to her red lips and then climbed back to her eyes. No one else can do it, Hazel. You know that, he murmured, the threat sheathed in velvet. And Gregory here was just leaving, weren't you, Greg? He turned that gaze on the actuary, and he didn't say a word, didn't pull back his jacket to show the Glock holstered at his ribs. He simply looked at the man with such absolute unhurried promise of violence that Gregory Adler practically came apart at the seams. Right. Yes, early morning. Gregory threw 2 20s on the table and would not meet Hazel's eyes. Lovely to meet you, Hazel. Truly. Good luck with the shipments. And then he was gone, all but sprinting for the doors. Hazel sat frozen, her chest rising and falling hard beneath the crimson silk, the humiliation boiling over into something white-hot. She turned her head, slow and deliberate, to look at Lucian, who had already slid into the seat Gregory had vacated, and was watching her with an expression of obscene satisfaction. You, she breathed, are a monster, I'm aware. He reached across, picked up her glass of Pinot, turned it until his mouth found the exact spot her red lipstick had marked the rim, and drank slow, his eyes locked on hers and burning. Now, let's talk about that dress. My dress is none of your business. Her voice trembled. She tried to hold her rigid posture, but the booth had shrunk to nothing with his shoulders blocking the only way out. He was looking at you like you were something behind glass in a museum, Lucian said, his voice dropping to gravel, his gaze sweeping the plunging line of the wine-colored silk, with a hunger he no longer bothered to hide. Like he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. Hazel. Her name came out of him like a confession. You are not something behind glass. A flush climbed from her chest to her hairline. For 5 years she had buried this. Buried the way her stupid heart kicked whenever he walked into a room, buried it under spreadsheets and shell corporations and the cold comfort of being indispensable. She was the heavy-set bookkeeper. He was the untouchable king of the North Side. The lines had been drawn in permanent ink, and tonight, for reasons she did not understand, he was scribbling violently outside them. I'm your employee, Mr. Ferraro, she said, gripping her clutch like a lifeline. And I'm going home. You're coming with me. His tone left no room. I wasn't lying about the shipment, and I'm not leaving you alone on this street, in that dress, where every idiot in the city can stare at what's mine. Her breath caught. What's mine? Before she could find the words to answer that, he was up, towering over the table, his hands akintended. For one long beat she considered refusing. Then she saw the look in his dark eyes, saw that he was fully prepared to throw her over his shoulder and carry her out of a Michelin-starred dining room without a flicker of shame. And she put her soft, manicured hand into his large, scarred one. The heat of his skin shot straight up her arm and down her spine. He didn't let go. He pulled her against his side, his arms sliding around the generous curve of her waist, anchoring her to him as he walked her out past the bowing matron and into the night. The October air hit her flushed face like cold water. Rush Street was quiet at this hour, amber under the street lamps. Half a block down, Lucian's armored black SUV idled at the curb, Renzo standing at attention by the rear door. I can take a cab, she said weakly, making no move to pull free of the warm, solid weight of his arm. You're getting in the car, Hazel. His voice gentled by a fraction. He lifted his thumb and brushed a stray dark curl away from her cheek, and the tenderness of it, so foreign, so impossibly out of character for the man she'd watched order broken bones over breakfast, stopped her heart cold. You look beautiful tonight. So beautiful I want to burn this whole city down just to keep you safe. He was looking at her mouth. His head was tilting down. Her heart slammed against her ribs. He was going to kiss her, right here on the sidewalk. The kiss never came. The The roar of an engine ripped the night apart. A black sedan, headlights killed, came screaming around the corner of Bellevue, tires shrieking against the pavement. Lucian's instincts, honed over 2 decades in the bloodiest rooms in the city, fired a half-second before the rear window rolled down. Down, he roared, and he didn't push her. He tackled her, his massive frame slamming into hers, his arms wrapping around her head and shoulders as they crashed onto the cold concrete. The breath punched out of her lungs. The silk of her dress tore at the knee. The world dissolved into the staccato hammer of automatic fire. Sparks burst off the brick facade of the restaurant. Glass shattered somewhere above them. People screamed inside Marrow. Lucian didn't flinch. He covered her body completely with his own, and with his free hand he drew the Glock in one fluid, blindingly fast motion, rolled an inch off her, came up on one knee, and returned fire. Cold, methodical, precise. One round took out the sedan's side mirror. The next blew a rear tire, the heavy car slewing wildly. Down the curb, Renzo had already drawn a compact submachine gun from beneath his coat. The kind of thing that looks impossibly small to anyone who's only seen guns in movies. And he laid down a brutal spray that sent the crippled sedan limping away on its rim, fishtailing into traffic until it vanished into the dark river of the city. Silence crashed back down, broken only by distant sirens and the sobbing from inside the restaurant. Lucian dropped the weapon to his sadza and fell to his knees beside her, and his hands were shaking. A thing Hazel had never in 5 years seen happen. He ran them frantically over her arms, her back, the soft curve of her hip, searching for blood. "Hazel! Hazel, look at me!" His voice cracked with a panic that did not belong to the man she knew. He cupped her face, thumbs wiping grit from her cheek. "Are you hit? Tell me you're not hit!" "I'm fine," she gasped, struggling up. Her knee was scraped raw, the wine-colored silk ruined with dirt and asphalt, but there were no holes in her. "I'm okay, Lucian. You're bleeding." A round had carved a clean red line across his left bicep, soaking the sleeve black. He didn't even glance at it. He hauled her to her feet, his grip on her waist like a vice, half carrying her toward the SUV. "Get in!" He shoved her into the leather interior and dove in after her. Renzo, the Astoria penthouse now. The engine roared and the car launched into the night, leaving the bloody chaos of the Gold Coast behind. In the back seat, the adrenaline was thick enough to choke on. Hazel was shaking violently. She had orchestrated things like this on paper. She had moved the money that bought the bullets, signed off on the wire transfers that paid the men, lived a half step from this kind of violence for 5 years while keeping her own hands spotless and her own heart locked away. But she had never had it happen to her body. She had never felt a man throw himself between her and death, without a half-second's hesitation. Lucian gripped his bleeding arm and stared straight ahead, his jaw a hard line, his mind churning. "That wasn't random," he said, more to himself than to her. "Greco, he waited until I was exposed. He knew I'd be here. He stopped, turned his head slowly to look at her. "How did he know I'd be here, Hazel?" And that was the moment Hazel Bishop stopped shaking. She straightened in the seat. She wiped the smeared lipstick from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, smearing it like war paint. And when she spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the timid, tidy bookkeeper, and what was left underneath was something cold and brilliant and absolutely in command. "He didn't know you'd be there, Lucian. He knew I'd be there." She met his eyes. "Because I made sure of it." He went very still. 3 days ago," she said, "I found a back channel in the books. Nico Greco's been bleeding you for 8 months. Skimming the laundromat take, routing it through a front in Gary, building a war chest. Tonight's sit-down was never about the docs. He was going to agree to your terms, shake your hand, and put 2 in the back of your head before the appetizers came out. I saw it in the ledger before he ever saw it coming, and you didn't tell me." His voice was deadly quiet. "I couldn't tell you. You'd have walked into that room with your guard up and he'd have known I'd found it, and then he'd have known there was a leak, and then they'd have come for me. Because I'm the leak, Lucian. I'm the only person alive who can read your books and his at the same time." She pressed her thumbnail into the side of her finger, that old nervous tell. "So I gave him a better target. I made a reservation under a name I knew his people watch. I put on this dress. I walked into the most public restaurant in the city, and I made myself visible, and I let Greco believe his window was me, that he could rattle you, draw you out, hit you in the open while you were distracted by the fat little bookkeeper playing at a love life. I needed him to act tonight on my schedule, on my ground, with Renzo already in position, instead of next week in a room I couldn't control." Lucian stared at her, his bleeding arm forgotten, his whole world quietly rearranging itself, And while he was busy watching me, Hazel went on, softer now, I emptied him out. The war chest in Gary, 22 million. I wired it into a numbered account in Geneva at 4:58 this afternoon, right before I walked to the elevator. By the time his shooters were getting in that car, Nico Greco had just discovered he's broke. He didn't hit you tonight because he hates you, Lucian. He hit you because he panicked when he checked his accounts and found out the woman he'd written off as furniture had taken everything he had. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the tires and the rasp of Lucian's breathing. Then he laughed, low, breathless, disbelieving, and dragged his uninjured hand back through his dark hair. She was a genius, a ruthless, devastating, gorgeous genius, and he had spent 5 years looking right past her. You went on a date with an actuary, he said slowly, reaching out to grip her waist, drawing her across the seat and into the space between his spread knees, knowing Greco was going to try to put me in the ground tonight. Gregory was an alibi. He was a prop. He was a distraction, Hazel admitted, her voice cracking at last, her hands coming to rest against his broad, hard chest. She looked down, suddenly and terribly vulnerable. I knew you'd have me followed. I knew you'd come. Her breath hitched. I wanted you to come. Why? His hand slid up the soft curve of her hips, pulling her flush against him. Because I was tired of being invisible to you, she whispered, and a tear finally broke loose and tracked down through the grime on her cheek. 5 years, Lucian. I run your empire. I bleed for this family. I keep you out of prison and I keep you alive, and to you I was just a machine in a cardigan, the fat girl who balances the books. Don't. The word came out of him fierce, raw, his hands tightening on her thighs through the torn silk. He pulled her down onto his lap, heedless of his wounded arm, buried one hand in her thick dark hair and forced her to look at him, his eyes blazing. Don't you ever call yourself that again? You think I don't see you. Hazel, I haven't looked at another woman in 5 years. Not since the day you walked into my office in that terrible grey suit and found 3 of my own men stealing from me before lunch. Her breath stopped. I didn't touch you, he said, his voice thick and unsteady, because you were the only clean thing left in my entire filthy life. I thought if I put my hands on you, if I dragged you into this, into me you'd run. I thought I'd ruin you, so I let you be a fixture. I let myself pretend you were furniture. Because the alternative was admitting that the most dangerous person in my organization was the only one I couldn't live without. His thumb traced the tear down her cheek. But watching that soft, harmless little man look at your body tonight, it broke something in me I didn't know I still had. You're mine, Hazel. Every brilliant thought in your head, every soft inch of you, you always were. I was just too much of a coward to say it. She made a small, wrecked sound, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was nothing careful. It tasted of expensive wine and adrenaline and 5 years of swallowed wanting, and she melted into it, her arms locking around his neck, her soft body fitting against his hard one like the city had been built wrong everywhere except this 1 square foot of back seat. His hands moved over her like a man who had been starving and had only just been told he was allowed to eat. Up the line of her ribs, across the generous swell of her, learning her, worshipping her, drinking in the plush, undeniable weight of her with a low groan against her mouth. He loved the fullness of her thighs under his palms, the soft curve of her belly, the absolute, unapologetic femininity of her shape. He had never in his life held a woman who fit him so completely. You're perfect, he breathed against her jaw, dragging his mouth down the column of her throat. God help me, you're perfect and I've wasted 5 years. We're being shot at, Lucian, she managed, even as her fingers tangled in his dark hair and her head fell back to give him more of her throat. Were, he corrected against her skin. We were being shot at. Renzo, eyes on the road. On it, boss, Renzo said from the front, with the long-suffering tone of a man who had seen everything. She laughed then, wet and disbelieving, and he pulled back just far enough to look at her, really look, the way he should have looked 5 years ago, and a slow, lethal, blood-streaked smile spread across his mouth. What about Greco, she asked. He still has shooters. He still wants you dead, and now he wants me dead too, because I'm the one who took his money. Lucian's hand settled heavy and certain on the lush curve of her hip, claiming her, anchoring her, the smile never leaving his lips. Nico Greco is a man who just found out he's broke, exposed, and outmaneuvered by a woman he never bothered to look at twice. He'll be dead by Sunday, and it won't be my hand that does it. It'll be his own people, the second they find out he's got nothing left to pay them with. He tucked a curl behind her ear, his eyes going dark and sure. You didn't just save my life tonight, Hazel. You won me a war before the first shot was even fired. Let Renzo and the captains clean up the body. Tonight, the only thing I'm running is you." And as the armored car carried them up Lakeshore Drive, the lights of the city he ruled smearing gold across the black water, the cold king of the North Side bent his head and kissed his bookkeeper again, slow and deep and certain, like a man who had finally, after 20 years of taking everything he wanted by force, found the one thing he intended to keep by choice, because she had walked into the most powerful man in Chicago's life in a cheap gray suit, made herself small enough to disappear, and then, on a Friday night in a red dress, made the entire underworld look the wrong way while she quietly took it all.